welcome to the second episode of Medieval Monday. My name is Matthew Davis, and as promised last week, we're going to be talking a little bit today about the Digby Mary Magdalene, a 15th century play that I'm working on currently. What I would like to do prior to that, however, is give you a little bit of background regarding medieval staging practices and different types of medieval plays as sort of an indication of how they're different than their modern analogs, and also to understand why this particular play's staging might be important prior to next week, when we'll talk about Mary Magdalene as a saint and how she operated during the 15th century, and then we'll get into the actual meat of the play itself and the argument I'm trying to make about staging in 2 weeks from today. So this talk will be a little bit PowerPoint heavy. I have some pictures I want to talk about some, and we'll just get started. So let's begin with the proscenium stage, which is the one that most people are familiar with. Now, it's called a proscenium stage from the word proscenium, which actually means the stuff that's in front of the active scenery. And that arch there, which you can see here, is what's called the proscenium arch. And what that is, that's a visible representation of the fourth wall. The audience actually exists as the fourth wall of the performance. So if you have a room, you have 3 walls that are the stage, and the fourth wall is invisible, and the audience is the figure representation of the fourth wall. One of the things to keep in mind about a proscenium stage is quite often the performance is seen as sort of an insular, isolated thing. The whole reason why we have the concept of breaking the fourth wall is because in most performances nowadays, you don't acknowledge the audience as existing. There are some plays that will do it. Our Town, for example, at the very beginning will have characters that appear from out of stage to give information to the audience. Every once in a while, you have entrances that appear from the back of the theater and come forward to the stage. But primarily, the characters don't interact with the audience. This is significantly different than the way things were in both the early modern and the medieval period. Next, we have thrust staging. And thrust staging, as you can see here, is still sort of has that proscenium. You still sort of have a indication of it here, but the front of the stage has been thrust out into the audience, so the audience isn't sitting on that fourth wall, but is actually facing the stage on 3 sides. This is the type of staging that you would have seen in the Globe Theater. So if you were to look at the Globe, for example, the Globe will have that kind of 3/4 staging, and you sort of see the thrust stage here. It's the reconstructed Globe stage in London. You can sort of see that thrust stage here, but you can see how the audience surrounds the action on 3 sides. What this does is this requires the actors to acknowledge the audience much more, because they are they can see each other and they can see the actors. And the actors don't have the luxury of sort of stepping behind that proscenium arch, of kind of being framed by that archway. And what that means is that actors were much more likely to actually interact with hecklers, to interact with people who were saying pejorative things or interrupting the play than they are today. Now, you might have heard the phrase theater in the round for the type of performance that would have gone on at the Globe. It isn't really theater in the round, although it's easy to see why people start to think that, because the Globe itself was a round structure, and you do have sort of that 3/4, 3 of the 4 sides around the thrust stage, and it is rounded shape. A real theater in the round is a performance where the audience sits on all sides of the performance space of the stage. And so what you end up having there is the audience is intrinsically part of the performance. Because as an audience member, your focus is not necessarily on the performers themselves, like it might be, say, if you're going to watch television, you're going to watch a movie, or you're watching a performance with a proscenium arch. But you are not only watching those characters, but you are aware of the other audience members and their actions and reactions. So you become part of the performance, if not by interacting with the actors directly, then by being aware that the other members of the audience are interacting with you in watching the play. So you're all kind of performing the action of watching the play, even if you are not performing the action of interacting with the actual actors. So that's this kind of theater that we think of today. And this sort of globe theater, theater in the round type of performance that you see in the early modern era, that is much more a result of medieval hall plays than it is of some of the other kinds of plays I'm going to talk about, such as the place and scaffold play that Mary Magdalene is the tradition that it comes from. And what a medieval hall play is this is a hall in the castle in York, is a performance that is intended for the hall of a medieval lord or a guildmaster or a cardinal. And what you have here is the hall itself will have these trestle tables. People would sit and eat at the trestle tables, and then these can be broken down and moved away. You can think of these sort of akin to sawhorses that have boards across the top. That's essentially what they are. And they can be moved to the sides, and this space can be given over to dancing or to other activities such as drama. And a hallmark of the hall play is this sort of entrance and exit via existing spaces in the hall itself. It is a much smaller, more intimate play. It generally deals not just with religious concerns or major affairs of state, but concerns of the person who is putting it on, which is quite often the person who is actually owns the hall and is putting on the dinner or the 12th night performance or something along those lines. So if Digby and Mary Magdalene and plays of that type did not come from medieval hall plays, and what we consider sort of our modern theater did, the question is, what other traditions were available in the medieval period for people who wanted to perform dramatic works? And one thing that was available is what's called a pageant play. Now, this would have been generally plays that would be performed during the Festival of Corpus Christi or other religious festivals, not by a religious audience. This is not monks dressing up and putting on plays. These are lay people who either as members of religious or secular guilds, and by secular guild I mean a guild that is primarily relating with a trade of some kind, would put on these performances, and on these wagons. And you can sort of see here that the wagon itself is you can see the wheels here. This is the presentation of Christ to the doctors. And you can see that you have a wagon, you have a very sparse setup. There's a possibility that some of these wagons would have been 2 stories, or there would have been an ancillary wagon that would have come up on the side to kind of increase the space. But notice how you have these characters who are on the actual ground level where everybody else is, while you have the doctors, Christ, Mary, and Joseph up on the stage. So it is possible to use the performance space, use all this extra space that people have sort of given away and given to the performance as part of your stage work. So you aren't necessarily limited to this platform of these wagons, which would have primarily been about 6 by 12. Now, these sorts of wagons would have gone around the city of York. This is an example from the York pageant cycle, that we have 2 pageant cycles that were actually performed medievally, full cycles, from Chester and York. We have a cycle from, it was originally ostensibly from Wakefield, but in actuality it is an artificial cycle that was produced by a 16th century person kind of cribbing together medieval material from multiple sources. And that is generally called the Townley plays, based off of the name of the manuscript, the Townley manuscript, and the person who was involved in originally compiling them. And if you have taken a introductory English course that's had a medieval drama element, you have probably read part of the Townley cycle of plays. It's the Second Shepherd's Play. It's part of that cycle. The 4th one is called the End Town. And End Town is also an artificial cycle of plays, and it's called End Town because that N stands for the Latin word nomen. And you might think of it along the lines of insert name here plays. So it was kind of created as a manuscript that you could eventually decide to perform as your town or your city with insert name here. So how this sort of thing would have worked is that we have here the city of York. It's a map of the city. And what I'm going to do, this is a simulation of the pageant route that was produced about 15 years ago. So you'll have to forgive sort of the clunkiness of the graphics and such. But as you can see, the plays start and individual plays are being performed in different spots throughout the city. And there are a number of different possibilities for plays. It could be either 32 or 48 plays. And this is a simulation with 48 plays and with 12 stations. By that, it means there's 12 individual places in the city where the entire cycle is performed. And so an audience would go to one of these stations, and the first wagon would come by and give its performance. And that would be the very beginning of what's called salvation history. So it would be the creation of the world. And then it would move on to the next station, and the next play, the fall of Adam and Eve it might be, would show up at that station and give their performance. And they would move on to the next play. And so forth and so on until the entire sweep of salvation history from the creation of the world through to Armageddon and Judgment would go through all of these 12 stations. And it could be 12, it could be 16, it could be 8. There's speculation regarding how many stations there actually were in performing these sorts of plays and scaffold plays. But what's interesting about this is a major civic undertaking. If you think about it, to put on a play 12 times and then move on to the next wagon, that next wagon puts on the same play 12 times. You might think of it as akin to the Rose Parade or something like that, where there's different, as if the wagons, the parade floats go by. Quite often there are people dancing, there's performances going on. Imagine they stop and give a full play, and then they move on to the next station and stop and give them a full play. And this would require a lot of money. And we have records that indicate that some of these guilds quite often tried to kind of push off their responsibility for performing the play onto another guild, or try to get other guilds to help chip in, especially if it was a more expensive play. And we also know that these plays would have been a major tourist attraction. People would have come from outside the city to see these plays performed at Corpus Christi. And there are still performances of parts of the York cycle at York that go on every summer. So if you ever happen to be in York in the UK at the appropriate time, you can actually see some of these plays being performed. At the University of Toronto, they quite often will put on the York cycle, or parts of the York cycle. They have a society there that does a number of medieval dramatic works, and they will put on different medieval plays at different times during the year. So if in pageant wagon staging, we have this notion of a built structure that's raised up off the ground that represents a geographic area, and then it is moved from point to point throughout the city. It's not that far of a step to consider taking a space like a field or something like that and setting up the stages within that field, and either moving the audience between these stages or moving the actors between these stages, and having each stage represent a geographic location or a particular point where an event would occur. And that's sort of the idea behind locus and platea staging, or as you can see here, place and scaffold staging. You have scaffolds, which are individual stages that represent a geographic location. So from this French example, you can see that you have heaven, and you have Jerusalem, you have hell with a hell mouth, you have a ship and a sea, and all these are meant to be distinct geographic locations in a performance space. Now, in some of these plays, the audience and the actors would move between these locations. In others, the actual performance space would be circular in nature and would have scaffolds constructed on the outer portions of the ring, as well as some constructed within the place itself, the place being that undifferentiated performance space that's between the stages. So the entirety of the entire structure, the entire stage itself, including where the audience sits, becomes part of this place where people can perform. So what we're seeing here is the only extant staging diagram we have from Middle English drama of one of these plays and scaffold plays. It's from a play called The Castle of Perseverance. And there, it's actually set up so that you have God, you have the devil, you have the world, and you have the flesh. Now, the world and the flesh, these are the personifications of abstract concepts. So, the flesh, you have fleshly sins, worldly sins. The devil is, the devil's sins, and then you have a scaffold for God. So these are actual physical stages. And then you have a ditch that's around the place, the middle area where people will be performing. And you have a castle constructed in the very middle. The audience would have sat somewhere in this area. There are diagrams and reproductions of the performance reproductions where people try to put the play on and see what it takes to actually perform it. Where audience members would be sitting in this outer area around the ditch. There are ones where people would be sitting in the space on the place itself. And the only indication we really have about where the audience would be sitting here is stating that to not allow anyone to actually sit on the castle itself, because that will be the best place to view the play. And you don't want to let people sit on the castle because then they're obstructing the performance. So what we have here is we have a single diagram of how one of these plays might have been performed. And we can compare that with the French example, where it's possible this is intended to be in a straight line. It's possible that this is just sort of a two-dimensional representation of what would actually have been a curved stage. Or it's possible that it wasn't actually performed this way at all, and this is just an idealized representation of the performance. So the question becomes, if we have multiple examples of this kind of play, but we only have one staging diagram, can we assume that this is the way that they all were performed? And there's one other example, that's a Cornish example, where there are actually 8 scaffolds around a circle like this. But this is the only example in Middle English. And the issue is that quite often with the Digby Mary Magdalene, this staging is what is privileged, not necessarily what's in the text. So we'll talk about that here in just a sec. So what we're dealing with here is a question of how this play would have been performed, what the space would have been like. Would it have been this sort of round Castle of Perseverance style structure, or would it have been in a straight line, as we saw in the French model, or would it have been something entirely different? The reason why this matters and why it's so difficult for this play is because unlike the Castle of Perseverance diagram, where there's really 4 main scaffolds, and a 5th one with a castle, and there's actually a 6th one that's sort of off to the side between 2 of them, there are 37 named locations in the space that also have characters to perform on them. There are some places that are named in passing in character speeches and things like that that don't probably have an actual stage that indicates where they are. So what I would like to talk about 2 weeks from now is the way I see this play as having been performed, sort of building the structure up and doing it in such a way that pays attention to everything, not just the diagram itself, but also the play and the play text, but also contemporary ideas of the way the world works and how people might have seen their place in it, and especially how they might have seen the place of Mary Magdalene as a saint. The 15th century is particularly interesting because we don't have this sort of very narrow view of her, Mary Magdalene, that we have after the 16th century Reformation. Sort of the common ideas about Mary Magdalene, that she was a prostitute, that she was Jesus' lover, this sort of holy blood, holy grail, or Da Vinci Code kind of idea of Mary Magdalene that we have today. None of that's going on in the 15th century. Instead, what we have is we have a figure that is increasing in power as an idea over the course of the 15th century. And if this play was actually performed, there's indication it was performed in the 16th century in Chelmsford. But we don't have any records of a 15th century performance. But if it was performed in the 15th century, then we're talking about a performance that requires the kind of resources that would put some of these passion plays to shame. Some of the big pageants in York with the multiple stages rumbling through the streets. So for next time, what I would like to do is talk about Mary Magdalene as a saint, kind of the background, how she changes as a symbol from the 12th through the 15th century, and what the implications are of how she's portrayed in the actual Digby Mary Magdalene play, as opposed to sort of our common idea of how we see her today, or for that matter, how she's seen in the 16th century. And then the next week from there, I would like to talk about the ways in which that play can be staged, as I said, in a way that is authentic to the play as written, is authentic to the evidence that we have, which includes the Castle of Perseverance diagram, but is not just the Castle of Perseverance diagram, and which would also reinforce some of these notions of Mary Magdalene as a saint. So come back next time and we'll talk about Mary Magdalene, and then I'll see you in 2 weeks to talk about the staging of the play. Thank you very much, and remember, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them in comments, and I'll be happy to entertain topics that you're interested in, things you want me to talk about. You have a good day now. Bye.